The definition of indie authors has been evolving and changing, and there are quite a few different definitions of indie authors out there. So print on demand is a really growing industry at the moment. So that's where the book is only printed when somebody orders it. If you're not on Amazon, it's then very difficult to get your books into the hands of readers.
Helen Worthington-Smith is the author of Skin Deep, a compelling YA novel that explores themes of identity, self-worth, and the quiet courage it takes to be truly seen. Beyond her work as a novelist, Helen is a dedicated writing coach, passionate about helping aspiring authors step into their full creative potential. She offers guidance, support, and insight to writers who are finding their voice as well as shaping stories that matter. Helen is also the co-founder of the Protea Press, a writing cooperative built on collaboration, community, and the belief that great stories are born when writers feel empowered and connected. Whether it's on the page or in her mentorship, Helen's work is rooted in authenticity, encouragement, and the transformative power of writing. In today's interview, Helen will be sharing her journey of how she not only completed her debut novel, but how she also went about the self-publishing route. And for any aspiring author who is putting their first book together, I think you'll also enjoy some of the tips and tricks that Helen shared with regards to creating compelling twists as well as conflict in your book. So let me introduce you to Helen.
So Helen, what were some of the turning points that led to you actually sitting down to write your debut novel?
Sure. So hard-hitting question to start off with. When I was thinking about this in terms of what were those turning points, I think the first thing was me taking some time off from my physiotherapy work. So I never thought that I was going to be a writer. I didn't think writing was a thing that I could do. So I studied physiotherapy and then moved to the UK to work as a physiotherapist. But I was really struggling with a lot of stress and anxiety. It's a job that kind of uses a lot of brain power. And I was finding it really difficult to do anything creative outside of work. So I actually took 2 months off to try and discover kind of what I wanted to do. Over the time, I decided I was going to be a project manager, but I also started writing. And it was this moment where it was incredible. It was like I was accessing this kind of 80% of my brain that just had not been available to me because I was so stressed and anxious and worried. And I suddenly felt really creative. I started writing, and that's where I actually sat down and wrote the first draft of Skin Deep, my book, as a short story. I mean, not a short story. It was about 7,000 words. I thought it was a short story. And so I would say that would be the biggest turning point that really got me sitting down to write this book. But I would say the first time I actually started writing something of substance and something that could have been a book, I think I was about 16 and I'd read The Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan, a kind of random series, but I just loved it so much. And I got to the end of the series and I just didn't want it to end. I wanted it to keep going. So I thought, oh, why don't I write my own book in a similar world? I started writing something similar. In fact, it was so similar, it was probably the same story. But that was the first time I really sat down and started writing. So I think, yeah, having the headspace to do it, but also having that inspiration to want to write would be those two kind of big turning points.
I love how you created that time to write. And in that time when you sat down and you focused wholeheartedly on the story that was bubbling inside of you, what were some of the joyful moments and what were some of the challenges that you encountered?
So the biggest joyful moment would have been finishing the first draft. So actually getting to the end and writing the words, the end, and then printing it out and looking at it and, showing people the book. I think that would have been my sort of most joyful moment, because I think it's that moment where you realize that you did it. It's like you got to the top of the mountain, although that kind of leads me on to the challenging moment in that it was the realization that actually you felt like you'd gotten to the top of the mountain, but then that realization that there was so much more work to do. So the first draft is brilliant. It's a great thing to get to. And especially as a first-time writer, if it's your first draft of a book, it's amazing. But actually you realize that the real work starts there, because you then have to take that first draft, you have to, critically analyze it, almost tear it apart, redraft it. And each of those those sort of redrafting moments feels like another mountain that you have to climb. So I think that was the big challenge, that realization of actually not at the end, there's so much more that I still need to do. And then I think an additional challenge would be navigating the amount of information that there is out there on the internet about writing. So there's so many things about, you've got to plot your book. If you're not plotting it, then you're never going to write a good book. Or other people saying, don't plot, it'll kill your creativity. Just write and see where it goes. And then there's all the information about editing. You've got to pay an editor to edit your book, or, don't pay an editor, you can do it yourself. And trying to navigate what's right for me, who should I be listening to, what's going to work for me. That's a really big challenge.
It's so interesting for me that your main challenges really came after writing the first draft, because personally, facing the blank page every single time when it comes to writing the first draft, that paralyzes me. So are you a plotter or you're a pantser? Like, how did you actually just sit down, and how did that part not freak you out?
Oh my goodness. I think maybe it was so long ago that I've forgotten the trauma of staring at the blank page, because definitely that is a thing. That is a thing. So I think I'm probably more of a pantser at heart. So I do like to just sit down and discover where the story is going to go. But I've also realized, the more I've been writing, that having a skeleton idea is also really helpful, because otherwise you end up having to rewrite your book so many times, and it's incredibly time consuming doing that. Whereas having a plan means at least you know the general direction that you need to be going in. But I do find it really difficult to stick to my plan, so I'll often get to a point where I'll suddenly think, oh, wouldn't it be so cool if this were to happen, and then I find myself 10 days later down a completely different pathway, and then I have no idea how to bring it back to my original plan. So I think it's something I'm still wrestling with a little bit. I enjoy the process of writing.
So interesting to hear you say that, because when I read your book, it's like, thought you might go one way, and maybe you had planned it that way, and then I could almost imagine you getting there and being like, oh, this might actually be too obvious. You know what? I'm just going to throw this twist in, because I was genuinely surprised so many times, and I love it when that happens. I love it when I think I know what's going to happen and it doesn't happen. So do you have any tips or hacks for anybody who is wanting to craft compelling twists and turns in their stories?
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying that. I'm really glad that came across. And maybe the answer is to just write and see where it goes, and then surprise yourself with the twists. I think what I realized as I got to those points where I thought, oh, actually, wouldn't it be cool if this were to happen? I did then try and go back and try and lay down some of those hints that something was going to happen. So, if a character is going to suddenly do something a bit different, or, there's a twist around a character, kind of looking back and looking at all the scenes where that character appears and thinking, what little hints or subtle things can I put in here so that it's not, yes, it's surprising when the sort of twist comes, but also a reader can go back and kind of go, that's why they did that thing, because they were, all along were thinking that they were going to do something else. So in summary, I think really write the book, see what happens, see the sort of the story unfold in front of you, then start identifying areas where you think, actually, maybe it would be cool if I threw in this sort of curveball here, but then also lay the breadcrumbs so that it's not so out of the blue that it's a bit like, that's a bit contrived. Because I think that's the risk that you get, is something coming across as being, oh, I'm just going to put this in for the sake of putting it in, as opposed to it makes sense for the whole story.
So does that mean you're pretty flexible when it comes to writing your first draft? Because if you have these payoffs and then you need to go back to create the setups, often that might mean moving things around a little bit. And sometimes I'm embarrassed to admit it. I'd be like, that's too much work. So how do you approach that?
That's a really interesting one. And I was listening to an interview with an author the other day, and he was talking about how sort of seasoned writers are a lot better at doing that. So seasoned writers are very happy to cut out scenes or, make big changes once they've gotten to the end of the book or as they're going through. Whereas often newer writers, we feel, we love our scenes so much. We love what we've been doing so much, but also, we know how much work it took to get to the end. And as you say, it just kills you to have to go back and make all those changes. I try and tell myself, this is something I want to do. I want to make it the best that it can be. And I think I do have quite a strong perfectionist streak in me that kind of goes, I have to go back and fix that. Yes, it's going to be a lot of work, but I want it to be the best it can be. And so that's going to mean having to do the things that I really don't want to do. But I think it's just remembering that you're doing it for a good reason. You're doing it because it's going to make your story so much stronger in the end.
Yeah, it reminds me of this quote that I absolutely love. It says something along the lines of, this could have been a great book if only the author had been willing to suffer a bit more. So whenever I feel lazy, I'm like, come on, we want this to be a great book. Suffer, go back, you can do it.
I feel like I need to write that down. I've got a few kind of like mantra quotes and I feel like I need to add that to my list of quotes.
Okay, well, would you be able to share maybe one or two with us?
So my absolute favorite is, I think it's Edwin Louis Cole, who said, winners are not those who never fail, but those who never quit. And that's something I often remind myself, I'm like, come on, you will get there in the end if you just keep going, don't give up. So that's one of mine. And then when I was trying to keep up a writing routine, so I write quite early in the morning, which means waking up at about 5:30, which is quite tricky because, you're tired, you want to sleep. I wrote on a Post-it note the quote, I don't even know if it's a quote, but I just wrote discipline equals success. And I wrote that and stuck it onto to the side of my bedside table so that when I switched off my alarm, it was like the first thing that I saw. And then I just lie there and repeat it to myself and then go, yeah, you know what? I'm only going to be successful if I'm disciplined and get up now. So those are my two, but I'm going to add that to it as well.
They clearly work for you because you managed to not only finish your debut novel, but you've also chosen to self-publish it. So I'm curious, what made you decide not to go the traditional publishing route?
Yeah, so I think, it's an interesting question. And I often see, I'm sort of on threads having a look at questions that writers are asking. And it's a question that a lot of people do ask, should I go down the traditional route or should I look at independent publishing? I think to some extent the decision gets made for you. So I did try and query the book. I sent it to agents. I did actually almost 2 rounds of querying. So an earlier draft, I sent it out, but I realized now that draft wasn't ready. It wasn't the book that it could be. And then the book that I've got now, I did send it out to agents and I got one personalized response. It was still a no, but it was really encouraging. The agent said she really liked my work. She really liked the story, but it was too similar to other books that are out there and she didn't feel that she'd be able to sell it, which is interesting because I was kind of thinking, surely that's a good thing. If people are enjoying a genre, you want more of it. So the traditional publishing world is incredibly difficult to break into. It almost takes a lot of luck. Your submission needs to land on an agent's desk at the right time when that exact story is the thing that's selling or, there's a gap in the market for the story that you've told. So, in some ways that decision gets made for you if you just can't manage to find an agent who will be able to represent you. But the more I thought about it and the more I learned about the traditional publishing world, I also realized that there are drawbacks to going down that route. So, not having complete creative control over your work. Sometimes publishers or agents will encourage you to change storylines or cut out characters because, they might not sell. Whereas as the writer, that might be a really integral part of the story that you're trying to tell. And yes, it might not reach everyone, but actually it will touch somebody. And so having to then take that out is, you're sort of maybe not telling the story that you want to tell. Also things around cover design, you don't have a lot of creative control around that. And then the big one, you don't own the rights to your book. So the rights are then held by the publisher. So you can't take your book and go and publish it somewhere else or do something else with it, which for me feels such a scary thing. You've worked so hard on something and now you're handing it over. So after going through that journey of wanting to be traditionally published, but then realizing a lot of those drawbacks, I started thinking more seriously about the independent publishing route. And I joined up with 2 other writers. And I think that for me was the big turning point that really shifted the needle for me from wanting to be traditionally published to actually really enjoying being independently published. So I worked with 2 other writers. We set up an independent press and we worked together to edit each other's work, to design covers. We exchanged our skills throughout that process. And that was so enjoyable. And for me, I think that's what I would have wanted out of the whole traditional publishing. It's just somebody else who's there with you, walking that same road with you. So long answer, but that's how I came to the sort of indie publishing route.
So I'm going to come back to you and your friends. That's very interesting. I want to know more about that. But before we go there, would you paint a picture for us of what the journey was like after completing your debut novel to actually self-publishing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, after there's sort of almost different phases of completion when it comes to writing a book. So I think getting to the end of the first draft is one big checkpoint, actually write a book. The next bit is taking your first draft to getting it to a point where the overall plot is working, your character arcs are working, and you've sort of explained everything, and it's sort of a good reading experience. Once you've done that, so that would sort of be your developmental editing rounds, and that can take you, months to years, because you're basically taking a very rough first draft and getting it to a point where it's a readable book. From there, you then having to do a copy edit, which is where you're looking at each sentence, each word. Are you repeating words? Do your sentences flow nicely, or are they a bit jerky? How's your dialogue? So that's your copy editing phase. And once you've got that right, you're then looking at doing proofreading. So that's where you're looking for your spelling mistakes and your commas and full stops. And, it's just really that last polishing off and making sure it looks perfect. So
is that also the formatting part where they format it, or not yet?
So not even yet. So I think I didn't fully appreciate how long it takes for a book to go from, I've written a book to I've now got a published book. And I think that's why, because when people get publishing deals, it often takes 2 years for their book to actually come out. And now I know why. So once you've done the proofreading, you've now got a manuscript that's ready. So the next thing is the typesetting. So that's where you're looking at how are the words going to appear on the page. And it's amazing how much goes into that. So, if you pick up a book and you flick through it, you shouldn't be aware of the typesetting. It shouldn't jump out at you. You should just be looking through the book and just kind of seeing words on the page. But if typesetting is done poorly, the reader will notice it, and it can have a big impact on their experience of reading the book. And in fact, they can actually end up putting it down if your typesetting isn't done right. So typesetting, you're looking at things like your font, and oh my goodness, the amount of time I spent looking at different fonts that you're like, surely these are exactly the same, but do I want this one? Do I want that one? So choosing your font, the font size, and you're also having to think about industry standards. So for a young adult book, you're going to have potentially a different font size to a book for adults. So yeah, you're looking at font size, line spacing, your margins, your indents at the beginning of the paragraphs. So like how deep you want your indents to be. So typesetting is a massive skill, but there are some great programs available to writers to help with the typesetting process. So I used Scrivener. It took quite a lot of sort of tinkering with to eventually get it to how I wanted it to be. But I sort of got there in the end. So once you've got done your typesetting, the next bit is looking at your things like your cover design. So, what's going to be on the front cover, what's going to be on the back cover, writing the blurb, and also thinking about all the pages that come inside the book, because you've got your copyright page, you've got a title page, you've generally got a dedications, as well as your acknowledgements at the end. So yeah, there's a lot, and that's called your front matter and your end matter. So you get all of that, you've got your cover. Then the next bit is to actually get the book printed, deciding how are you going to do that? There are different options. Print on demand is a really growing industry at the moment. So that's where the book is only printed when somebody orders it. So they can print one book at a time or 100. So print on demand, there are a lot of options as well. Different companies who do print on demand books. There's also the sort of large batch printing that you can look at. So there are big printers in the UK. It would be someone like Clays or the CPI group, and they generally print books like you would find in a bookshop. So, you know, they work with your Penguin, your Simon Schuster, but they also do printing of books for indie authors. But there you have to order, I think a minimum order is either 100 or 400 books. So you're having to order quite a lot of books. And then, of course, you need to work out your distribution. So distribution is how do you get the book from the printer into the hands of your reader? That's really what your distribution is. There are so many different options, but some of them take a long time. We had some issues with ordering and delivery. And eventually we did also decide to go with Amazon print on demand for printing our books, which felt really frustrating because it almost feels like Amazon's got a sort of a hold on the market in terms of that's where everybody buys their books from. If you're not on Amazon, it's then very difficult to get your books into the hands of readers. So we also used Amazon print on demand. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the journey of the book. And then once you've got the book out there, the final part is advertising, actually raising the profile of your book, talking about it and getting people to read it. So yeah, long journey there, but hopefully that's a bit of an understanding of how we get the book published.
I am never going to give a bad review to any book again because to just get a book out there, the amount of respect I have for somebody for just seeing that process through, unreal. Like, I cannot believe it. Well done. The fun part is putting the book together, but then, you know, there's so much admin involved. It just, wow. And I'm sure just steep learning curves every single time. So all the respect in the world, power to you. But you said, I think you referred to yourself as an indie author. So how would you define indie authors, and what would you say are some of the biggest struggles that indie authors face?
Yeah, and again, it's an interesting question because I think the definition of indie authors has been evolving and changing, and there are quite a few different definitions of indie authors out there. So I think some people think of indie authors as being synonymous with self-publishing, so an individual who on their own has published their book. Other people define indie authors as either self-published or authors who are published through independent presses. I think for me, the way I would see an indie author is an author who retains the rights to their work. So they've published their work, but they retain the rights to it, as opposed to your traditional publishing where the author hands over the rights to their work to the publisher. And what was the second part of the question?
What would you say are some of the biggest struggles they face?
So the biggest struggles that indie authors face are really, I would say, advertising and getting your work out there. Your sort of traditional publishers, your big publishers, they have a lot of relationships with the big bookstores. So in the UK, that would be Waterstones. You know, in South Africa, it would be Exclusive Books or Bargain Books. So they already have those existing relationships. So when a new book comes out, those bookstores will generally stock it, and then readers will be able to get hold of your book. But for an indie author, you're having to form all of those connections yourself. You don't have the same thing that traditional publishers have, where they have kind of a name for themselves. So a bookstore might go, oh, okay, Penguin has published this book, therefore it must be a good book. As an indie author, all you've got is you and your name, and nobody knows your name. So they're going, why would I publish your book? So having that name recognition is really difficult. And the sort of promotion on social media, I would say, is such a challenge for indie authors. It's so difficult to stand out in the crowd. There are a lot more indie authors now, I think, than there have been in the past. And so it starts to get really difficult to try and get you to stand out against everybody else. So I think those are the two kind of really big challenges that indie authors face.
So earlier on, you said that indie authors might have been defined as people who are part of an independent press. Would you say that the Protea Press is an independent press. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, definitely it's an independent press. So it's not sort of one of the big five, and all of our writers retain the rights to their work when they publish through our press. So Protier Press is an author collaborative. So we are 3 authors who are working together. The way we work is that we basically share our skills with each other. So we all have different skills. So, I bring some of that creativity in terms of the cover designing and the ability to use different software to do that. One of the other writers, Katie, is absolutely amazing at copy editing and proofreading. Sophie's really good at the developmental editing side of things. So we all bring something to the table, and then we almost exchange our time for different things. I'll maybe get to a point where I'm ready for a developmental edit. I'll then send my book to both Katie and Sophie. They'll give me feedback on it. And then I kind of owe them both a developmental edit because they've done that for me. So then when they're ready, they send me their book and I do the same for them. So it's very much this exchange of skills and services. But I think it's a lot more than that, because it's also support. They are absolutely my support system. They champion me. I champion them. Whenever we're sort of talking about our own books, we're also talking about each other's books. And they're really the reason that I was able to get my book out. I wouldn't have been able to do it without them. Being a writer, it's a really lonely thing. Only other writers really understand what that journey is like. And so being in this cooperative, being in this independent press with Sophie and Katie has just been absolutely amazing in terms of my ability to keep going and actually my ability to have published my book.
And do you guys have goals to increase your reach with the Protea Press?
Yeah, definitely. In the future, we would like to support other writers to publish through Protier Press or kind of under our press name. At the moment, we're still, as you mentioned earlier, that really steep learning curve of trying to get these things right. We're still in that phase of making sure that we are really kind of doing all of the things correctly, getting the distribution right. Absolutely. In the future, we really do want to support other writers. But also, Sophie and I are starting to work on putting together some sort of support programs, some downloadable worksheets for other writers who are similar to us. So, maybe written a first draft or are kind of working through that first book, or even those writers who've maybe written a couple of books, but just aren't too sure where to go next. What do I do next? How do I get this book from this sort of draft that I've written to something that's ready to publish? So we've started that, and we've also got a podcast that we've started where we just talk about being a writer. So a little bit of a self-promo. Our podcast is called Daggers Daydreams, and it's available on Spotify and Amazon Podcasts at the moment.
Okay, that's really exciting. Could you tell us a bit more about what you talk about in your podcast? How's it structured? What is the goal with the podcast specifically as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we found really frustrating on our own writing journeys was how impenetrable the whole kind of writing world felt, and how, you'd come across articles talking about genres and ARC readers and beta readers, and you'd be sitting there going like, I have no idea what any of this is. I don't know what it means. Where do I start? What's the right thing for me? Yeah. So what we really want to do with the podcast is to break all of that down, not kind of talk through this industry jargon, but actually just talk about books and the writing process. We sort of share some of our own experiences, but then we talk about different things. So, we talk about genre. What is genre? But also, why is it important to know what your genre is? What are the different subgenres? How is that then useful when it comes to things like if you're going to self-publish your book and you need to get an ISBN number, you need to know your genre, because when you register that number, which is is the number on the barcode at the back of your book, you have to input information about your book, including what genre it is. So, we sort of talk about those things, but really explaining why it's important and helping people to really understand their options as opposed to saying, this is what you should be doing. We're coming at it from a point of view of, these are the options. And actually, these are maybe some of the things that you could be thinking about to help you decide what's the best route for you. And we really just want to create a community of writers, so a place where other writers feel seen, feel heard, and can kind of join a group of writers similar to them. That's our aim with the podcast. We've got one episode out at the moment, and we will be releasing them weekly, so watch this space.
Exciting. Okay, well, I will link to the episode of your podcast in my description. But before you go, I have one more question for you. Could you tell us a bit about your debut novel, Skin Deep, as well as maybe recommend one or two other books that have really made you smile or have moved you recently?
Well, I did prepare for this question. I've got my book here. So my book, Skin Deep, it's a young adult dystopian fantasy, and I'll explain why I refer to it as both dystopia and fantasy. But basically, it's set in a world where people develop permanent imprints, which look like tattoos on their skin in response to really strong emotions or particularly important life events that happen to them. And people get judged based on what sort of imprints they have on their skin. And the way society is organized is that you've got this sort of affluent society where everybody has to control their thoughts and feelings so that they only produce the sort of the good imprints, the right ones. And then you've got the rest of society who haven't managed to do that. The main character is a sort of 16-year-old who's grown up in this affluent area. She's had to control her thoughts all her life. And then something happens to her where she develops the imprint of a criminal, and she has to basically escape and then try and work out who she is outside of this tight control that she's had to live under. There's also government plots and scheming, all the good stuff, and some great fight scenes. So, and the reason I sort of refer to it as dystopia and fantasy is because it's dystopian in that it's set in a world that is organized by a government with quite rigid control, and it was originally sort of set up to make things better for people, but because it's been taken to that extreme, it actually makes things worse for everyone. So it's got all of those dystopian elements, but the fantasy element is obviously these permanent imprints on the skin, which isn't something that can happen in real life. So that's the sort of one fantasy element, but the rest of the world is all very much like our own world. So that's the only fantasy element there.
I loved that part about the book. I thought it was so original. What did you think of my description of the two comparisons that I had? The Giver meets The Hunger Games.
Yes, yeah. So I absolutely. I think really in terms of The Hunger Games, I think it's the feel of the world, because obviously it's not the same story, but it's very much that the feel of the world, like quite gritty, urban, the setting, and then absolutely The Giver, in terms of our kind of thoughts and memories, and a lot of stuff happens internally as well. So I think I would also add Divergent to the list. I don't know if you've read Divergent. So Divergent is also set in quite an urban world where people are categorized into different categories based on their kind of skills. So you've got the people who are very kind of caring and giving, and they sort of all live together and work together. You've got the people who are very analytical, analytically minded. They all work together. So they sort of, society is organized like that. And then the main character, she doesn't really fit into any of those categories, and she's called a divergent because she sort of has hallmarks of all of them. So, I think for me, I really enjoyed the Divergent series, and I think that was a big influence on me in terms of my writing. But in terms of your other question, I went and pulled the books from my shelf to tell you about what I've enjoyed recently or what's made me smile. So I also selected books that are all by female authors with very strong female main characters in them, because that's what I enjoy. That's what I write. Wayward, absolutely amazing, quite kind of witchy. This is a story of 3 women in different time periods, but their stories sort of interlink. One woman is accused of being a witch in the 1600s. Another one is living in the sort of 1950s. And then the last characters in modern day times. And yeah, it's very sort of strong female power in that. Book was my absolute favorite series growing up, The Song of the Lioness. It's a quartet, and again, it's sort of a strong female character who wants to be a knight and pretends to be a boy so that she can train to become a knight. So I really enjoyed that. And then my last recommendation is Fledging by Rose Deal. So, this is a book about this sort of decision to remain child-free as opposed to have children. And it's a fictional account of a woman going through the journey of making that decision. And it's really well written. It's really funny. And I really enjoyed it. And I think, it's sort of a conversation that's happening more and more nowadays. And I think it's really helpful to kind of have an account from that point of view. So yeah, those are my 3 books that have made me smile recently.
A huge thank you to Helen for taking up the time to come and have this chat with me today. I'll make sure to link the resources that I mentioned in the description below so you can check that out. And I'll see you in a future video. Take care. Bye.